Helen's Temper and Its Consequences. Chapter 2. To Seem and to Be. Helen was not long walking home and found an unexpected guest in her mother's parlor. Mr. Holt, her grandfather, lived 2 miles off and had come to take tea with his daughter, Mrs. Smith, who had been left a widow 4 years before our story opens. Helen sprang forward to kiss her grandfather and then turned round to answer her mother's question. "Where is Betty?" "She will soon be here, Mother. We met a beggar girl as we came from school, who said she had lost her way. I fancy she was pretending a little, but Betty was silly enough to believe her, and said directly she would take her home." "I should call that kindness on Betty's part," said Mr. Holt seriously, for Helen's tone and manner did not please her grandfather. "Well, perhaps it was," replied Helen. "Only the little girl was very lame, and so poor I should have been ashamed to be seen with her. But Betty does not mind. I believe she would go with a chimney sweep if she were asked." "Be quiet, Helen," said her mother. "Your tongue runs too quickly. Take away your hat and cloak, for I am going to get tea ready." "Helen grows fast," remarked Mrs. Smith to her father when the door had closed on her daughter. "Yes," replied Mr. Holt, "she is taller, but I am not quite sure that she grows wiser. She has a great many faults. Helen is too fond of dress and very much afraid of being laughed at by her friends. But she is apt and clever at her books, and she learns her lessons while Betty is thinking about hers," answered Mrs. Smith. "Learning is not the chief thing in life, daughter," said Mr. Holt gravely. "No, my dear father, I know it is not, and I often think that though Betty is not so clever as Helen, she is more kind and generous, ready to help everyone and to do good to those who need her assistance, as far as she is able. I only wish she loved her books better." Saying these words, Mrs. Smith left the room and went into the kitchen to see if the kettle boiled. She sent Helen to her grandfather while she prepared for the meal and cut the bread and butter. Mr. Holt questioned his grandfather about the lessons that Mrs. Hearn had taught her that Sunday afternoon, and Helen gave a good account of all that she had learnt. She was able to remember the substance of what her teacher had said, and spoke so sensibly that her grandfather felt she quite understood the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he only hoped she would apply her knowledge to her daily life. "Are you going to be like the Good Samaritan?" asked the old man, "and help all who need your assistance?" Helen did not much care about answering this question. Her conscience told her that though she was able to remember all she had heard and learned in the Sunday school because she had a good memory, she really did not care to apply it to herself. She did not mind about other people, whether they were happy or miserable. It was no matter to her. In fact, she knew that at heart she was much more like the priest and the Levite who passed by on the other side. But Helen was so accustomed to stifle her conscience that she answered with apparent interest, "I am afraid, dear grandfather, I cannot do much good while I am so young. When I am older, I shall try to help others." "No one is too young to be useful, Helen," answered her grandfather. "There are many neighborly acts that you may perform for others. You may lend your books and toys at school to your companions. You may speak kindly and encourage those who are not as clever at learning as yourself. You may be tender to your mother and try to save her anxiety and trouble. And if you met a rag girl in the street who has lost her way and is crying, You may take her hand, sympathize with her sorrow, and lead her to her mother. I thought you would remember these words of Scripture. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. As you are now, my child, so you will be when you grow older. And therefore it is important you should have right ideas and right feelings while you are young. I am glad that you know so much about the Scriptures, Helen, but I wish that you would try and carry God's words into all your actions. It was a great relief to Helen to hear her sister's step at this moment. Betty came in looking very much heated, for she had walked home quickly. "How are you, little woman?" said her grandfather kindly. "I hear you have been home with a poor lame child who lost her way." Betty was almost too much out of breath to answer directly, but gave her grandfather a bright smile, and, after a few moments, replied, "I do not know you were here, grandfather, and she was such a poor little girl and so unhappy that I felt I could not leave her. She was smaller than I am, not quite as old, and so shy and frightened, she would never have found her way home if I had not been with her." "You were quite right to take care of her," said Mr. Holt. "Always be useful, Betty, in little things." "Was the child so very poor?" "Oh, yes," replied Betty. "She had such old boots on and a rag cloak, and only think, grandfather, the boys laugh at her in the streets and point at her because she is deformed and lame." "Is it not wicked? She has a very clean face, and said her father and mother were once better off, and she had a beautiful white rose tree that she left behind in a little garden of her own when they lived in the country." By degrees, Betty told her grandfather the whole of the conversation that had passed between herself and Louisa, and closed by saying, "And she has promised me that she will go with us next Sunday to the school." "With us?" thought Helen. "I am not going with that nasty, shabby child. Why, Alice Hose and Mary Eames will fancy she is related to me. I will scold Betty well when I get her alone." While these thoughts were passing through Helen's mind, she was smiling graciously at her grandfather, and seemingly interested in listening to her sister's account. "Now, Betty," said Mr. Holt, "Helen has told me that what chapter you read at school this afternoon. Did you understand it?" "Yes, grandfather. Mrs. Hearn explained it so clearly to us that I quite understood it." "I think you must have, Betty. So much so that you were able to act the part of neighbor to Louisa. Is it not so?" Mrs. Smith summoned the trio to the kitchen at this moment, so that Betty only nodded her answer to her grandfather's question. The little family gathered round the table, and during tea time, Mr. Holt told his daughter and grandchildren the history of a young girl who lived near to him and was there lying at the point of death. "And though she is only 12, added the old man, "just her age, Betty, she believes in Jesus and rests entirely upon him, and trusts in him alone for salvation." Betty listened attentively, and Helen seemed to pay great heed to her grandfather's words, for she sat very still, but her thoughts were really far away. She was picturing to herself her friend Mary Eames' new bonnet and cloak, and wondering whether she could persuade her mother to buy her a new bonnet and cloak before next Sunday, and she would have them even smarter than Mary's, if possible. She determined she would coax her mother, though she was not quite sure of success. Mr. Holt did not remain long after tea was over, for he had some distance to walk home. Helen was rather glad to be rid of her grandfather's presence and his lectures, while Betty said to herself, "How nicely grandfather talks. He is so good too. Everyone loves him. I hope I shall grow up like him."